Welcome to this third talk about carbon pricing, which looks at the social cost of carbon. This talk is a little more technical in some respects than the first two, but I hope this illustrates some of the difficulties of applying economic concepts to a problem with as many dimensions as climate change. It's a well-established principle of environmental economics that emissions of pollutants should be priced according to the damage they cause. This broad principle, which dates back a century or so, is commonly discussed in terms of Pigouvian pricing, after the economist who first made the case for it, or, more broadly, as the polluter pays principle. This principle implies that carbon prices should reflect the cost of the damages caused by greenhouse gas emissions. This cost of damages is usually called the social cost of carbon. It can be used either as a reference point for setting a carbon price, or more generally as a benchmark to judge the cost effectiveness of emissions reductions. However, it's worth noting that the social cost of carbon is usually calculated globally, as damages are global, whereas the price will typically be set in one jurisdiction. That jurisdiction itself won't capture the full benefits of the emissions reduction. In this talk, I'm going to look at how the social cost of carbon is estimated, what some of its weaknesses are, and what these imply for how it should be used. So, how is the social cost of carbon calculated? The calculation depends on four main things. What changes to the climate result from additional emissions? What damages result from these changes to the climate? The cost of these additional damages? And how we balance cost now and in future. That is, how do we estimate the present cost of future damages? For the calculation, first a base case emissions track is specified. Estimates are made of the resulting damages, for example due to rising sea levels. The costs of these damages over time, such as increases in flooding or loss of food production, are then estimated. This process is repeated, adding more emissions and calculating the cost of the additional damages that result. The cost per tonne is calculated by dividing the cost of additional damages by the additional emissions. This is illustrated in stylized form here. Costs occurring at different times are converted to their present value using a financial discount rate. Damages occur over a very long period, so the choice of discount rate has a large effect on the answer. The calculations of damages are usually done using elaborate models known as integrated assessment models, although there are a number of problems with this, as we'll see. The US Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, has estimated the social cost of carbon and come up with a value of approximately $50 per tonne, at a 3% discount rate. This rises over time in large part because of damages becoming closer in time, so the costs are higher in present value terms. I have chosen EPA estimates from 2015 and converted them to 2018 dollars. This is a very useful and well-founded set of estimates that is probably as good as can be expected at the moment. However, there are some important issues with calculating the social cost of carbon. Many of these issues suggest that there are good reasons to suppose that modelling underestimates the true social cost of carbon. The first set of problems is uncertain and omitted costs. It is simply very difficult or impossible to know what damage climate change will cause or what the cost of the damage will be. Furthermore, many of the models omit important costs from the calculations, essentially assuming they are zero. For example, non-market costs such as the loss of ecosystems are excluded or underrepresented when they don't have a clear financial value. The second set of problems centres around whether the modelling is suitable for examining the risks of very large changes to the climate, including the risk of catastrophe. Models designed to estimate the cost of damages for a temperature change of 1 or 2 degrees may become highly misleading if used to estimate the cost of larger temperature changes. Damages may increase only quite slowly with small temperature changes, but are likely to increase quite rapidly thereafter, and perhaps catastrophically when certain thresholds are reached. This is often not represented adequately in models. For example, one widely used model shows GDP only approximately halving with a temperature rise of 19 degrees centigrade. This is unlikely to be realistic, and indeed the model's author has cautioned against its use for temperature changes above around 3 degrees. But temperature changes above 3 degrees will be likely under many emission scenarios, and the effects of such large temperature changes are a major cause of concern. This difficulty is compounded because most models treat GDP growth as exogenous, assuming that the drivers of GDP growth are largely unaffected by even very severe climate change. Over a century, even slow growth, anything above 0.7% per annum, more than doubles GDP, and so more than offsets the costs of warming, even if GDP is assumed to halve from the level that it would otherwise reach. Even with the temperature rise of 19 degrees over a century, people appear on average better off than today because the benefits of growth, more than doubling GDP, outweigh the costs of climate change, halving GDP. This result is clearly nonsense. Also, conventional economic costs may not be a valid measure of damages. For example, loss of agricultural output may represent a small proportion of GDP simply because agriculture is currently a small proportion of GDP. Nevertheless, very large-scale loss of food supplies clearly has much greater costs. This will, among other things, lead to large changes in relative prices which are not captured by the models. Furthermore, analysis often excludes some risks which are difficult to model, for example some types of climate feedbacks. This effectively assumes that they won't happen and so won't cause any damage, ignoring the risks. Indeed, even attempting to set a single average cost for damages fails to address the question of willingness to tolerate the chance of a cost much greater than the estimated average, due to low probability, high impact events. The EPA does estimate the cost in the upper tail of the distribution of damages, and some other modelling explicitly includes a range of sensitivities. However, these approaches go only part way towards addressing the problem of the risk of catastrophic outcomes, especially in view of the other limitations I've outlined. A related issue is that a framework based on marginal changes due to incremental emissions is simply not suitable for capturing the cost of the risk of catastrophe, which is often the most serious concern. Indeed, the discontinuities likely to arise with larger temperature changes raise fundamental challenges to the concept of marginal damage from a ton of emissions. This is one reason that the social cost of carbon can only ever be a guide to action. Finally, there are some important technical issues to be considered. The calculation of the social cost of carbon depends on assuming a starting point for the emissions track, and when you start will determine the cost of the additional emissions. This is because climate change varies with the stock of greenhouse gases, so a different assumed base emissions track will give different estimates of the cost. For example, assuming reductions relative to trend will typically give higher values for the social cost of carbon than starting from some assumed optimal track. Whatever the starting point, the choice of discount rate and whether it remains constant over time is crucial to the calculation. In practice, it is likely to be more appropriate to use a lower discount rate that falls over time, yet many models do not treat this issue fully. Indeed, different generations are involved, and consequently it is impossible to escape considering the ethical dimensions of the problem. Similarly, some regions will experience higher costs than others, and again, this raises fundamental ethical issues to which economic frameworks give, at best, limited guidance. Also, the process of assessing policy measures needs to take account of all costs and benefits. Measures to reduce emissions often have valuable co-benefits for health, which need to be factored into decision-making. An analysis needs to take account of future benefits for emissions reduction, for example in promoting early-stage technologies. So, given all these problems, is the social cost of carbon a valuable concept, or is it something that should be discarded? I believe that it has some value when treated with caution. In particular, most of the uncertainties and limitations imply that the calculations underestimate the actual cost of emissions. Consequently, any emissions reduction measures with a cost below the social cost of carbon are almost certainly cost-effective. However, more expensive measures might still be worthwhile. The need to limit total emissions remains. Also, the social cost of carbon is one of a number of indicators of appropriate levels for carbon prices, but it is useful as such. For example, another set of indicators comes from models and surveys that show the levels of prices that might be necessary to reach long-term emissions targets. All these indicators converge on a message that most current carbon prices are too low, and this is useful. So, the social cost of carbon is a useful reference point, but one more useful for ruling measures in than ruling them out. And in any case, judging which risks are acceptable will always be a matter of political and ethical debate, rather than a simple matter of costings. For this reason alone, the social cost of carbon can never be a complete guide to action. Thanks for watching. Further details, including a transcript of this talk and accompanying slides, are available on my website www.onclimatechangepolicy.org.